Hello everyone and welcome to Fiction Friday. Today's tale is a weird western titled Midnight Shadows. I hope you enjoy it. The thunder cracked so loud Patrick could hear it over the clatter of the stagecoach's wheels. To call the rutted path they followed through the tall grass a road would have been far too generous. He'd walked goat paths in the mountains smoother than this. He licked his dry lips. The air held little moisture and the dust constantly filtered in through the openings in the side of the coach. The canvas curtains that were supposed to keep it out were no help. A bump bounced him 6 inches off the hard bench seat and bruised his backside on the landing. At this point he figured his ass was more bruised than flesh. At least he was alone. He'd ridden in public coaches before on business, but today the bosses had been generous enough to give him one of the company transports. Not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because none of the stage lines ran out to this backwater town. At least he didn't have to ride a horse. Patrick hated traveling by horseback. He could do it, but only in extremes. He pulled aside one of the curtains and looked out. The town of Half Moon rose out of the prairie ahead of them, a ragged collection of homes and businesses with a single main street. What little information he could dig up indicated the town had sprung up near a big ranch and served the cowboys when they were off. All pretty standard stuff for South Texas. A storm was centered over the town and spread out about 5 miles in every direction. Beyond that, the skies were clear and blue. It wasn't a subtle blending either. A hard line separated sun from storm. It was far from natural. Of course, if things were natural, no one would have sent for Patrick. Unnatural was his bread and butter. About 15 minutes Pat, Dirk, his ill-tempered driver, shouted over the roar of the tires. Patrick grimaced at the use of his hated nickname. No matter how many times he told them, everyone called him Pat. They probably did it just to piss him off. He scratched the week's worth of stubble covering his jaw and shook his head. He didn't even bother complaining anymore. Lightning flashed, outlining the cross at the top of the town's church. His frown deepened. He had only marginally less distaste for the church than he did for horses. His dislike aside, they had their uses from time to time. He slid the curtain shut and leaned back in his hard seat. On the bench beside him sat a thick tome bound in black leather. He ran his finger along the raised letters. Holy Bible, they spelled out. How many times had he run his fingers over those raised letters over the years since they kicked him out of the seminary? More than he could remember, that was certain. His eyes closed and he forced the past back in the bin where it belonged. He had more than enough to worry about in the here and now. Patrick used the final minutes to focus his mind on the task ahead. Details were scant, but according to the telegraph message the town's sheriff sent, something had crawled out of a grave and killed a man before running off into the night. That had been 10 days ago. Hopefully they weren't riding into a ghost town. Whoa! The coach slowed and clattered to a stop. Patrick opened his eyes, unlatched the door, and climbed down, his holy book tucked under his arm. Directly under the storm, it was nearly as dark as night. That was never a good sign. Up and down the street, not a soul could be seen. Dirk tossed his heavy leather satchel down from the roof. I'll be on my way. Good luck, Pat. You're safer here, Patrick said. I can't protect you on the road. Whatever's haunting this town could run you down and tear you apart. Dirk checked his pocket watch and shook his head, setting his dusty bowler askew. 3 hours till sunset. I can make it to the bar tea before then. You get this sorted and come find me. So long. The rain snapped and Dirk was on his way, leaving Patrick in the middle of the empty streets choking on a cloud of dust. He couldn't really blame Dirk for getting out of this creepy place as fast as he could. Just showed the driver had good sense. Patrick preferred not to think what it said about him. He watched the departing coach until it was out of sight, slung the strap of his satchel over his shoulder, and set out to have a look around. Every building he passed was dark and silent, the only movement coming from signs blowing in the wind. The low metal-on-metal creak set his nerves on edge. 100 feet further down, a shadowy figure emerged from a left-hand building. The build and hat argued for a man, but Patrick couldn't be sure. A light flared and he winced, spots filling his vision. Blind and helpless, he waited for the attack to come. Nothing struck him down, and slowly his eyes adjusted to the glare filling the street. When they did, he found the man had closed the distance between them. The barrel of a revolver gaped 6 inches from Patrick's head. Patrick blinked a few times to make sure he was really seeing what he saw. The armed man didn't turn out to be a hallucination, so he focused on what was before him. A 3-day-old salt and pepper beard covered his face. Hard, deep-set green eyes bored into Patrick. He didn't dare look away, but out of the corner of his eye Patrick saw a tin star on the man's vest. The sheriff, at least, was still alive and retained his humanity. It was the first good sign he'd seen since arriving in this cursed town. As long as you didn't count the gun pointed at him. Would you mind lowering your pistol, Sheriff Stone? Those things have a tendency to go off. Who are you? Stone's voice was harsh with nerves and worry. The sickly scent of whiskey rode his breath. Talk fast or I'll blow your brains all over the street. My name is Patrick Morgan. I work for Six Guns. I believe you sent for me. He gave Patrick one last long, suspicious look, lowered his pistol and uncocked the hammer. Only when it slid back into the holster at his waist did Patrick let out the breath he'd been holding. Sorry, I'm a little jumpy. The sheriff held out his hand, and ignoring the grime, Patrick shook it. Let's get off the street. We can talk in my office. It was a short walk to the sheriff's office. The light that blinded Patrick came from a hurricane lantern fitted with a polished reflector. It made a hell of a spotlight, that was certain. The young man holding it looked about 16, with a baby face, thin mustache, and watery blue eyes. The fact that he wore a star argued that he was older than he looked, or Stone was more desperate than Patrick assumed. My deputy, Kent, the sheriff said. Kent and Patrick exchanged nods, and the young man moved out of the doorway. The office was built from the same basic blueprint as many other jails Patrick had visited in his travels. There were 2 desks made of rough-hewn timbers set across barrels, 2 doors that he assumed led to cells, and a rack filled with lever-action Winchesters, double-barreled shotguns, and 1 lonesome Sharps. A fair arsenal for such a small town. Kent was staring at him, and Patrick quirked an eyebrow. You don't go heeled? Kent asked. Not when I'm traveling by stagecoach. It's uncomfortable, Patrick said. Why don't you fill me in on the situation? The sheriff scratched his head. The first one of those, whatever the hell they are, came shuffling into town 2 weeks ago. 16 days, Kent said. Right, maybe an hour after sunset. I figured it was someone that got drunk, passed out, and just came to. Anyway, Todd, the blacksmith's assistant, goes out to see what's what. This thing grabs him and rips his arm off, easy as you might twist a leg off a roast chicken. Now, Todd's a big boy, but it didn't matter. He bled out before anyone could help him. The thing wandered off gnawing on his arm. I put 6 rounds through his chest and it didn't even flinch. It just shuffled off to the graveyard with its snack. Did you follow? Patrick asked. From a fair distance, Stone said. Damn monster crawled into a grave along with its meal. Didn't see it again until the next sunset. This time it brought friends. 2 more of them. 3 more, Kent said. Right, 3 more. This time everyone stayed inside and barred their doors. They roamed up and down the street until sunup, then back to the graveyard. Was the storm overhead yet? Patrick asked. That didn't show up until 10 days ago. Stone looked at Kent, who nodded to confirmation. Patrick set his satchel on the nearest table and opened it. He removed 3 steel flasks and set them beside the satchel. Each was marked with a specific rune on the cap, but were otherwise identical. Have there been any deaths besides the unfortunate apprentice blacksmith? Last Friday the Logan family had had enough, Sheriff Stone said. They packed their wagon and lit out of town at noon. The damn monsters ran them down out of town, killed all 5, tore them to pieces. We can't even bury them because the damn graveyard is haunted. Patrick frowned. There was something left to bury? They weren't devoured? Now that you mention it, they weren't. Stone pushed his hat back on his head. I mean, there were a few pieces missing. Most of their bits were still there. Does it matter? Certainly. At first, I assumed we were dealing with ghouls. But if they left the bulk of the bodies behind, then there's something else. You have the bodies in storage, I assume? What's in the flask? Kent asked before the sheriff could answer. I could use a drink. One is holy water, one a solution of suspended silver, and the last one a solution of suspended iron. Depending on what we're up against, one of those should do the trick, though I don't recommend you try drinking them. The bodies? They're at the Doc's place, locked in a shed out back. Stone checked his watch. We got time before sunset. Want to go take a look? Indeed I do. The Doc's place looked exactly the same as every other building on Main Street. 2 stories with clapboard siding, badly in need of a fresh coat of whitewash. Shutters closed, still and silent. The only thing that separated it from the rest was a sign out front that read Dr. Smith. If the guy was an actual trained doctor, Patrick would sell his boots. Still, in this part of the world, beggars couldn't be choosers. Sheriff Stone walked up the 3 front steps to the door and rapped with a heavy knocker. "Come on, Doc, open up. The expert's here and he wants to have a look in your shed." Patrick smiled at being called an expert. No one was an expert when it came to the supernatural. He knew a little more than most, which is as close as you got to being an expert. "You ain't from around here, are you?" Kent asked. "No, I was born and raised in New York City. I attended the seminary before the Monsignors and I had a falling out. It became rapidly obvious that heading out west would be good for my health." Kent barked a laugh. "How dangerous could a bunch of priests be?" Patrick gave him such a hard look that the deputy took a step back. "You'd be surprised. Challenging orthodoxy is a threat to the church, and that is one thing they won't abide." The door opened, cutting off the uncomfortable conversation. Patrick didn't enjoy thinking about his past, much less talking about it. A middle-aged man with a rim of gray hair circling his bald head peered out at them through wire-rimmed spectacles. He was dressed in a white shirt and dark vest and matching trousers. "Thank goodness, Sheriff," the doctor spoke in a faint German accent. "The last 2 nights, there have been noises coming from the shed. I fear it is only a matter of time before whatever's in there forces its way out." "They're corpses, Doc. Can't see them forcing themselves out of a locked shed," Kent said. "Maybe, maybe not," the doctor said, "but I'm still glad you're here to deal with it." Doc Smith handed the sheriff an iron key, slammed the door, and slid home the bolt. It seemed the good doctor wasn't going to accompany them to the shed. Patrick didn't blame him, but he would have liked to get the man's opinion on the dead men's wounds. Sheriff Stone led the way behind the doctor's house. At the rear was a dirt yard surrounded by a fence with a single shed not much bigger than an outhouse as its sole occupant. A heavy iron padlock held the door shut, though given the state of the wood it wouldn't hold someone determined to escape. The sheriff reached for the lock and Patrick said, "One moment." He took his 3 flasks out of the satchel and nodded. Sheriff Stone slipped the key into the lock, clicked it open, and let back. Both lawmen drew their revolvers and pointed them into the shed. It seemed to make them feel better, even though they had to know by now that the weapons were useless against the creatures they faced. And the stench that wafted out of the shed, heaven's mercy, even a 2-day-old battlefield never smelled so bad. In the dim light, a shifting mass was visible. Patrick cursed himself for not bringing a lantern. All he could see was patches of flesh writhing around in a way no human ever had. The mass oozed toward them and everyone took a step back. Inch by wretched inch, the horror crawled forward. The first thing that emerged was an arm half again as long as Patrick's body and massive as a tree trunk. It appeared to be made up of a mixture of calf, pectoral, and thigh muscle for more than one corpse. Kent scrambled back and got violently ill beside the fence. Patrick didn't blame him. He'd seen plenty of disgusting things in his career, but this might have been at the top of the list in terms of pure nauseating presence. The shoulder and head emerged, prompting a gasp from the sheriff. "That's Todd, or most of him anyway." As he unscrewed the first flask, Patrick considered everything he knew. Clearly the curse had attached itself to both the unlucky apprentice and the murdered townspeople. Finding no body sufficient to serve as a host, the magic had fused the remains into this thing. Lucky for them, the amalgamation was an awkward host at best, and the power controlling it was having difficulty getting the body to move the way it wanted. That was good, as it would make a formidable opponent when mastered. Patrick walked over and poured a trickle of liquid onto the creature's hand. The flesh bubbled and hissed, raising an acrid green smoke. They were undead, as he suspected, though a different type than he first thought. As long as the holy water worked, they should be fine. "What now?" Stone asked. "Now we finish this poor creature off and go find his friends." Patrick reached into the satchel and pulled out a leather-wrapped bundle. Inside was a long-barrel Colt frame, 2 cylinders, and 96 cartridges marked with runes that matched the flasks. Nimble hands and long experience let him load the cylinders with holy water cartridges and snap the frame together in seconds. "They're coming." Ken made his way from the back fence to the street, probably to get away from the stink. "How many?" Patrick stood and slung the satchel over his shoulder. "All 4, and they're moving faster than before." "They know they're under threat," Patrick said. "How could they?" Panic tinged the sheriff's voice. The monsters are all linked through their shared curse. They must have felt the holy waters burn. Quiet now. I need to focus. Patrick closed his eyes, took a deep breath of foul air, and chanted, Holy light, grant me the power to free these cursed souls and return them to your embrace. Warmth and power flooded into Patrick. When he looked at the massive flesh crawling toward him, he now saw black veins of energy running through it. The veins all originated from a ball of darkness in the center of its chest. They're getting closer, Kent screamed. Patrick took aim, cocked the hammer, and fired. The bullet struck the black ball dead center. Holy water burst out of the hollow point, purifying the darkness. The massive flesh went still, and out of habit Patrick made the sign of the cross. One down. He marched out to join Kent on the street. 4 dark figures, each with a ball of darkness in them, half shambled, half jogged toward them. Colt barked twice before the survivors turned and ran back the way they'd come. Steadying himself, Patrick fired a 3rd time. The shot missed the monster's core by an inch. Damn it! Patrick ejected the spent shells and reloaded them with more holy water-filled hollow points. I can't let them escape. Burn the bodies. I'll be back as soon as I'm able. You're going alone? Sheriff Stone asked. Neither of you can see the corruption, and I don't have enough bullets to let you waste them. Just be sure and destroy the bodies. Patrick ran down the street after the retreating monsters. Hopefully the sheriff would heed his advice and burn the 3 corpses down to ash. The dark power wouldn't be able to reoccupy them, and he wouldn't be forced to exercise them a 2nd time. The monsters he was hunting ran to the town graveyard. They sat on the outskirts, down a dirt track, and was surrounded by a simple iron fence. Out here that metal must have cost more than some of the buildings in town. A wealthy benefactor must have paid for it. Headstones, a few of them actually made of stone, jutted up in crooked lines. He still had an hour until sunset, but the clouds made it seem like midnight. Only sideways shafts of light provided any help. Patrick paused outside the open gate. He suspected the undead had dug themselves back into their graves. Before he went in, he needed to confirm something. With one eye on the cemetery, he dug a sealed box out of his satchel. Inside was a black feather he'd taken from a 6-eyed crow, the first demon he exorcised. He took the feather and stuck it in the dirt just inside the gate. No reaction. As he feared, the cemetery had never been properly hallowed. It wasn't a surprise. The number of priests that knew the proper ritual and took the time to perform it were few. An unhallowed graveyard was like a candy store to a diabolist. He tucked the feather away and stepped across the threshold. Corruption ran through the cemetery, making it impossible to track the undead to their graves. Luckily, the disturbed earth narrowed things down. He'd just have to check each one. The first disturbed grave was 20 feet in and to his right. In his right hand he held his cocked pistol, and in his left the open flask of holy water. Steeling himself, he poured a trickle of the blessed water onto the loose earth. The dirt steamed, but no monster emerged. With that grave sealed, he moved on to the next. It was near the center of the graveyard and looked fresher than the first one. A splash of holy water brought a roar of pain. Patrick leapt back just ahead of a grasping hand. The monster had a ball of corruption in its skull. He fired. Its head exploded, sending bone and darkness flying. The remains collapsed and didn't move. He let out a sigh of relief. Now he just had to eliminate the last one and find the source of the curse. It sounded so simple when he thought about it like that. A chill ran up his spine. It was the only warning he got. He twisted aside, taking a heavy blow on his shoulder instead of on the side of his head. Patrick flew across the graveyard, crashing through headstones and coming to rest against the iron fence. Ouch. He turned and saw the hulking form of the last undead stomping his way. The monster was a mass of dark energy. The curse appeared to have focused all its strength on this final monster. Patrick shook his groggy head to clear it, took aim, and fired. The holy water-filled bullet slammed into the monster's chest. It roared with pain and charged. Patrick fanned the hammer, emptying his cylinder into the beast. The final shot blew its head apart. The creature collapsed 5 feet from him, its darkness purified. He wiped the sweat from his brow and got slowly to his feet. That had been way too close. One by one, the spent cartridges popped out of the cylinder. He went back to his satchel to reload. Damn monster had knocked him a good 30 feet away. It was a miracle all his parts were still working. A hint of movement to his right prompted Patrick to spin left. Intense cold turned his left arm into a dead weight. He dropped flat to present as small a target as possible. Floating above an undisturbed grave was the gray ghost of a fallen gunslinger. It wore a long duster, boots, broad-brimmed hat, and a two-gun rig low on its waist. Where its eyes should have been, blood-red flames flickered. The specter's rage and hatred washed over Patrick like a chill wave. A ghostly bullet skimmed over his head, numbing the skin. Loading his pistol with one hand wasn't easy, not to mention his holy water bullets wouldn't work on an ethereal opponent. Lucky for him, he had another option. A third bullet nearly hit his ass. 2 shots in the cylinder would have to be enough. He spun the rounds into place, grabbed the flask of holy water, and threw it at the specter. When it was only a foot away, he fired. The force of the bullet splayed holy water everywhere. The specter writhed in silent agony before vanishing. Patrick finished reloading and made his painful way over to the grave where the specter had emerged. The marker said Don Black, and the date was 50 years ago. Maybe Sheriff Stone would recognize the name. He looked up into the sky. The clouds hadn't started breaking up. The curse remained strong, which meant Patrick still had work to do. Before setting out for the town, he fired 3 rounds into the grave. That should be enough to purify it and prevent the specter from returning to its body. By the time he got back to town, Patrick had shaken some of the feeling back into his arm. It was still numb, but the pins and needles in his fingertips, he figured the damage was only temporary. It was damn lucky that phantom bullet only grazed him. A direct hit might have rotted his arm right off. In the center of the main street, a bonfire was roaring, and a few people had emerged from their homes. Not many, but a few. They stood in a loose circle around the fire as if it could ward off the monsters in the darkness. It couldn't, but he didn't intend to point that out. These people had been through enough. As he approached, Sheriff Stone stepped away from the fire and went to meet him. "I heard gunfire. Is it over?" "Not yet. There's one specter left to deal with." "Does the name Don Black mean anything to you?" "Of course. Everyone around here knows Don Black. Before the town's founding, him and his crew robbed stages and banks before riding back here to hide. When a posse finally finished him off, the leader saw this spot and thought it would be a good location for a town." "What's Black got to do with this?" The specter rose out of his grave. "I drove it off, but failed to kill it. It must have a lair in the area. I thought you might have an idea where." The sheriff scratched his head and adjusted his hat. "They used to hole up an abandoned trading post. Don't think there's much left of the building, but if he's anywhere, that's my bet." "How far is it from here?" Patrick asked. "1.5 miles north. You can't miss the ruins. It's the only thing out there for miles in any direction." "Are you going tonight?" Patrick checked his watch, then the sky. He had about half an hour of daylight left. That was pushing it, but he had no choice. If the specter wasn't destroyed and the curse lifted, new undead would rise from the cemetery and he'd have to begin again. "I'm not thrilled about it, but yes, I'm going tonight." "You burned the bodies?" "Yep. Couldn't risk them getting back up." "Good luck. You want a horse?" Patrick shuddered. The last thing he wanted was a horse. No animal would go near the place while the specter's there, and it might panic and throw me. Better if I walk. The sheriff nodded, and Patrick set out at a quick jog. Away from the town, it really was bleak. Luckily, he couldn't make out much detail in the dim light. A little less than 10 minutes later, he spotted a few timbers jutting up out of the dry grass. There wasn't much left of it. He stopped half a mile away and opened his satchel. Against the ghostly opponent, his pistol was worthless. He pulled out a sheathed bowie knife instead. The weapon was his most prized possession. He freed it from its sheath and allowed himself a moment to admire the complex pattern. The blade was Damascus steel, combining layers of regular steel with pieces of a relic used to banish a demon 600 years ago. It had taken half a year to track down those shards of metal, but the results were worth it. The knife was infused with divine energy and was capable of purifying even the most powerful source of corruption. He set his satchel down and approached with his weapon at the ready. With its grave purified, the specter would have nowhere to retreat, which meant no escape. It would fight all the harder because of that. His grip tightened as he moved closer. Patrick forced himself to relax. Tense muscles reacted slower, and he would need every moment if he wanted to survive this fight. A quick circle around the ruins revealed nothing. He moved in for a closer look. The front door was long gone. Inside, the floor had collapsed into a root cellar. Something flickered with a sickly green light. Patrick was so distracted by the light he almost missed the sudden chill in the air. Instinct prompted him to leap right. A black bullet whizzed past him. He rolled to his feet and spun. The spectral gunman faced him, both pistols raised. In a fight with a living gunman, Patrick wouldn't have had a chance. Lucky for him, ghost guns didn't shoot as fast as real ones. The left-hand pistol fired. He spun right, avoiding the bullet. He danced around 2 more shots, coming out unharmed, but no closer to his opponent. And while ghost guns didn't shoot as fast, they didn't run out of bullets either. The only way he would win this is to take a hit. Patrick clenched his jaw and charged. The left gun fired. He spun, avoiding the shot. 3 steps separated him from the specter. The right gun fired. He turned, taking the hit on his left shoulder. Before the specter could fire again, Patrick closed the last 3 strides and drove his blade into the ghostly body. There was quite a bit of resistance given the creature's lack of a physical form. In seconds, the holy blade unraveled the specter until only wisps of darkness remained. Patrick badly wanted to collapse, but he wasn't done yet. Ignoring the pain in his limp left arm, he made his way back to the ruin. With nothing trying to kill him, he was able to take his time and clamber one-handed into the root cellar. On a primitive altar sat a human skull surrounded by green flames. Jagged demonic runes covered the skull. This was the source of the curse. He was certain of it. Bracing himself, he drove the holy blade into the skull. An inhuman wail filled the air, grating on his ears and making his eyes water. When it fell silent, only shards of bone remained. Patrick looked up. Already a gap in the clouds had formed, revealing an orange and purple sunset. Now it was over. The walk back to town seemed to take far longer than the walk out. Patrick's satchel felt like it weighed about 50 pounds, though all he'd added were the bone shards. When he got back to 6-gun headquarters, he'd soak them in holy water until they fully dissolved. That was the only way to be certain any lingering demonic energy couldn't be used by some other lunatic looking to cause trouble. Smoke from the bonfires reached him before the light. The fires must have been burning down. Overhead, the clouds had fully dissipated. It would be a clear night, perfect for stargazing, although all Patrick wanted to gaze at were the insides of his eyelids. He'd probably been more tired, but he couldn't remember when. His shoulder throbbed where the ghost bullet passed through, and he still couldn't use his left arm. He suspected when he took his shirt off he'd find a big black circle where it passed through his flesh. A purification poultice should see him set to rights by morning, assuming he could muster the energy to make one. He shuffled into town half an hour after leaving the trading post. The fires had burned down to embers and most people had gone home. Only Sheriff Stone remained outside, his lantern lit, a beacon in the dark. Patrick headed for it, glad for the brightness after his long dark walk. "Is it over?" the sheriff asked without preamble. "It is. The undead will trouble you no more, though I recommend you dig up and burn every body in that graveyard. Cremation is a much safer way to dispose of bodies." The sheriff nodded, but Patrick doubted he'd follow through. People seldom followed through on his recommendations. That was the sort of foolishness that kept him employed, so he supposed he shouldn't complain. "I don't know how we can thank you," Sheriff Stone said. "I do. You can pay the rest of your bill and send a rider out to the bar T to fetch my driver in the morning. Damned if I'm walking out there. Oh, and point me toward a bed. I'm beat." Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Fiction Friday. If you'd like to buy a copy of the short story you just heard, you can find a link in the description. Be sure to leave an offering to the algorithm by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Until next week, goodbye.